So the president just got told no by a federal court over a $400 million White House project. And I want to explain exactly what happened inside that ruling, because this isn't just about a ballroom. Quick thing before I get into the details. Drop the country you're watching from in the comments so I know who's along for the ride tonight. I actually do read them. So there's a part of this decision yesterday that most of the news cycle completely blew past. And I want to explain it to you, because once you understand what was actually written in that court order, the whole thing looks different. This wasn't some little procedural slap on the wrist. This was a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C., telling a sitting president that what he's doing on his own property is illegal. It's a 2-to-1 ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And they sided with the Preservation Group, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. That's who won this round. Now you might be thinking, okay, a preservation group. That sounds like a bunch of historians in tweed jackets, right? Not this time. They went after the president over something genuinely massive. The White House Ballroom project. $400 million. That's not a typo. $400 million. And the court found that the president demolished substantial portions of the White House without getting Congress's permission first. Substantial portions. That's the phrase they used. Now stop and think about that for a second. The White House isn't just some building. It's the most historically protected address in the entire country. You can't just knock down walls and build ballrooms like you're renovating a suburban basement. But here's where it gets really interesting. The court didn't just say stop. They said the whole operation is unlawful. That's a strong word, a really strong word. And they paused their own ruling for 14 days, which means they know this is going straight to the Supreme Court, and they're giving the administration time to get there. Now let me pull the thread on this a little more. The D.C. Circuit is usually considered the second most powerful court in the country, right after the Supreme Court. When they rule on something involving the executive branch, people pay attention. And this was a 2-to-1 decision, which means one judge disagreed, dissented. And that dissent, well, I'll get to that in a minute, because what that dissenting judge wrote might be even more telling than the majority opinion. But hold that thought. Here's what we know for sure right now. The president had plans, big plans, a $400 million ballroom. I mean, we're talking about a space that could host state dinners, high-dollar fundraisers, probably a few weddings if anyone's keeping track. This wasn't some minor touch-up. This was a major construction project, and he just started doing it without asking Congress, without going through the normal preservation reviews, just started demolishing stuff. Now let me step back for a moment and give you some history on why this is such a big deal. Because this didn't happen overnight. This has been brewing for months, almost a year actually. Back in early 2025, there were whispers about White House renovations. And I remember hearing those whispers and thinking, okay, every president does some updating, new carpets, maybe a fresh coat of paint. Biden did some work on the heating system. Nobody cared. But this was different. By mid-2025, the price tag started floating around. At first it was $100 million, then $200, then somebody leaked $350. And by the time the administration finally admitted the number, it was $400 million. Now ask yourself, where does that money come from? Not the federal budget, not exactly. There's a private fundraising component, sure, but you're still using government property, government resources, government land. The National Park Service oversees parts of the White House grounds. So even if the money is private, the authority is public. And that public authority is supposed to answer to Congress. And that's the part that gets me. Because the White House is not the president's personal property. You know that, right? I mean, we all know that. He lives there, he works there, but it's not his house. It's the people's house. And the rules that protect it, those rules exist for a reason. The National Historic Preservation Act. That's the law the court cited. And it's been on the books since the 1960s. It requires federal agencies to consider the impact of their actions on historic properties. And the White House is, it's about as historic as it gets. So the president demolishes part of it, the preservation group sues, the court says, hold on, you can't do that without permission. And now everyone's waiting to see if the Supreme Court bails him out. But here's the part that makes me genuinely uneasy. This ruling wasn't about funding. It wasn't about budget battles or political squabbles. It was about the separation of powers, plain and simple. Congress has the power of the purse, and Congress has oversight over federal property. That's Article 1 of the Constitution. It's been there since day one. And if a president can just bulldoze parts of the White House without checking in with Congress, what else can he do without checking in? Now let me walk you through the court's actual reasoning, because I think this matters. The majority said the president's actions crossed a line. They said the National Trust had standing, which means they had the right to sue. And they said the demolition, the actual physical removal of historical structures, constituted a major federal action that required prior congressional authorization. That's a really specific legal finding. They didn't just say it was a bad idea. They said it was unlawful, as in it violated federal law. That's the kind of language you usually hear when a federal agency has overstepped its authority, not when a president is building something. Now, I mentioned the dissent earlier. The dissenting judge wrote something that really caught my attention. She argued that the National Trust didn't have standing, that they couldn't prove they'd been harmed by the renovations. She also argued that the project had been approved in other ways through other channels, and that the court shouldn't second-guess the executive branch on national security grounds. National security. That's the part that made me pause. Because think about this. The president is building a ballroom. A ballroom. And the argument from the dissenting judge was that this touches on national security. Maybe there's something we don't know. Maybe there's a secure component to this project. Maybe it's not actually a ballroom. Or maybe that's just the label they gave it so nobody would ask questions. And that brings me to something that's been bothering me all day. $400 million. $400 million. That's not just a building project. That's a statement. It's a physical reminder of power. It's the kind of thing you build when you want to leave a mark that can't be erased. But demolishing historic parts of the White House to do it, without asking anyone, the more I read about this case, the more I think it's about something bigger than a ballroom. I think it's a test of how far a president can go before the courts push back. A test of whether the checks and balances we learned about in civics class actually hold up under pressure. And so far, the courts have held. Barely. But the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in yet. And honestly, I don't know what they're going to do. Let's look at the timeline here because this is important. The ruling came down Friday. The administration has 14 days to appeal to the Supreme Court. So we're looking at the end of August, maybe early September, before we get a final answer. And in the meantime, the Ballroom project is on hold. No demolition, no construction, just stopped. Now, the administration's response was pretty predictable. They said the court overstepped. They said the president has authority over the White House as the commander-in-chief. And they said the National Trust is just a group of activists trying to block progress. But here's the thing. The court didn't say the president can never build his ballroom. They just said he has to go through the proper channels. He needs Congress's permission. That's not a ban. That's a delay, a bureaucratic requirement. Unless the administration doesn't want to ask Congress. Unless they know Congress would say no. And that's what this is actually about. Not the ballroom. The power to do it without asking. So let me ask you something directly. Why wouldn't the president just ask Congress? Why go through all this? The lawsuits, the bad press, the legal uncertainty. Why not just get the approval the court says you need? Unless you know they'd reject it. And if you know they'd reject it, and you do it anyway, then you're openly defying the legislative branch. That's not just a disagreement. That's a constitutional crisis simmering on low heat. Now let me talk about the reactions I've been watching, because the political world is already in motion. Democrats are celebrating this ruling like they just won a championship. Schumer put out a statement calling it a victory for the rule of law. Pelosi's old allies are saying this proves the president can't be trusted with historic properties. They're using this to build a narrative about executive overreach. But Republicans, they're quieter, much quieter. Some of them are avoiding the topic entirely. Others are saying the court was politically motivated. And a few are just hoping it goes away. But it's not going to go away, because this ruling is too clear, too direct, and the Supreme Court is now the only hope the president has. And that's where I start to get really uneasy, because the Supreme Court right now is not exactly predictable. You know that. I know that. We all watch the news. We all know what's at stake with every case that lands on their docket. If they take this case, and if they side with the president, then we've just established a new rule. The president can demolish historic federal property without congressional approval. Think about what that opens the door to. The Lincoln bedroom, the East Room, the Rose Garden. If the president can just tear down walls anywhere he wants, what's stopping him from remaking the whole White House into whatever he imagines? That's not a question about a ballroom anymore. That's a question about the very idea of a public trust. The White House is supposed to belong to all of us. Its history belongs to all of us. And when one person decides they can erase parts of that history, what does that say about the rest of our shared institutions? Now, the Preservation Group, the National Trust, they're not some fly-by-night operation. They've been around since 1949. They've protected thousands of historic sites across the country. They take this stuff seriously. And I gotta say, I'm kind of glad someone is taking it seriously. Because if nobody pushed back on this, if every court just rolled over, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. The ballroom would already be under construction. The walls would be gone, and nobody would have said a word. But somebody did, and that matters. Now let me talk about the global reaction for a second, because this hasn't stayed in Washington. I've been watching international coverage. The British press is having a field day with this. The French are laughing. German outlets are using this as a case study in American dysfunction. I saw one Australian columnist say, and I'm paraphrasing, "This is what happens when you elect a developer as president." That's not just a joke. That's a perception problem. Because when the world sees the leader of the United States bulldozing the White House to build a ballroom, they don't see a leader. They see someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them. And that perception, fair or not, is a real liability for American influence overseas. So let me bring this back to you, to the person watching right now. You live in this country. You pay taxes. You care about what happens to the institutions that govern you. And right now, you're watching a president challenge those institutions in a very public, very expensive way. And it's not just about a ballroom. It's about the principle. Can the executive branch act without legislative oversight? Can a president use private funds to demolish public property? Can one man decide that his legacy matters more than the history of the people's house? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They have real answers. And the court just gave us one answer. But the Supreme Court might give us a different one. And that uncertainty, that's what's keeping me up at night. Now, I promised I'd get back to the dissenting opinion. Let me read you a little bit of what that judge wrote, because I think it reveals something important about the legal strategy the administration is going to use. She wrote that the National Trust couldn't prove they had standing. She said the demolition didn't cause them direct harm. And she said the court should defer to the executive branch on matters involving the White House, even if they're controversial. That's the argument. Deference. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Respect the president, give him the benefit of the doubt. But deference has limits. And when a president demolishes historic property without congressional approval, those limits get tested. The majority said, yes, this is a step too far. The minority said, no, we should trust the president. And that's the divide we're going to see play out at the Supreme Court. So what happens now? Well, the administration is going to file an emergency appeal. They're going to ask the Supreme Court to lift the pause on the lower court's ruling. They're going to argue that the project is too important, too necessary, too much a matter of executive prerogative. And the court will decide whether to take the case. They could deny the appeal. They could hear it. They could issue a quick ruling or drag it out. If the Supreme Court denies the appeal, the ballroom is dead. $400 million in planning, in fundraising, in construction prep, gone. And the president has to go back to Congress with his tail between his legs. If the Supreme Court takes the case and sides with the administration, then this ballroom gets built. And a lot of lawyers are going to spend a lot of time arguing over what that precedent means. But if the Supreme Court sides with the administration and does it quickly, that sends a message, a very clear message. And the message is that the courts will not check the executive branch on these kinds of decisions. And that's a message that could echo for decades. Not because of a ballroom, because of what the ballroom represents. The willingness to ignore the rules. The belief that the ends justify the means. The idea that if you have enough money and enough power, you can do whatever you want. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, Matt, is this really that big a deal? It's just a building. And I get that. I really do. On the surface, it's just a building. A fancy building, but still just a building. But it's never just a building. That's the thing. The White House has been there for over 200 years. It survived wars, fires, assassinations, economic depressions. It's been renovated, modernized, changed. But it's never been partially demolished without congressional approval. That's new. And that's why this matters. Let me take you through the next phase of this, because what I'm about to describe is what happens when political power and legal accountability clash head on. The president is going to campaign on this. He's going to use this ruling to galvanize his base. He'll say the courts are biased. He'll say the preservationists are enemies of progress. He'll say this is the swamp fighting back. And his supporters, they'll eat it up because they want to see him fight. They want to see him push back against the establishment. A ballroom doesn't matter to them. The fight matters. But the other side, they're going to use this as evidence. Evidence that the president is out of control. Evidence that he needs to be reined in. Evidence that the Constitution is under attack. And the middle, the folks who aren't paying that close attention, they're going to hear about it and think, $400 million for a ballroom? And check out. But they shouldn't check out. This is one of those moments where the small story tells the big story. And the big story is about whether the rules still apply. So let me tell you what I think is really going on here. And I want you to think about this. I think this project was always going to be controversial. I think the president knew it would be controversial. And I think he proceeded anyway because he believed that by the time anyone could stop him, it would be too late. He almost got away with it, but the court stepped in, and they did it fast. That's the part that gives me some hope, honestly, because it shows that the institutions are still working. Not perfectly, not quickly, but they're still there, still pushing back, still enforcing the rules. Now, we don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do, and I'm not going to pretend I do. If I could predict the Supreme Court, I'd be making a lot more money doing something else. But I can tell you what's at stake. If the Supreme Court upholds the D.C. Circuit's ruling, then the ballroom is dead. But more than that, it sends a signal that the courts will enforce the law against the president, that no one is above the rules. If they overturn the ruling, then the ballroom gets built. And a future president, any future president, can demolish whatever they want as long as they can raise private money to do it. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between a government of laws and a government of men. And I don't know about you, but I didn't sign up for a government of men. Now, the 14 days the court gave the administration is interesting. That's not a long time. It's barely enough to file the paperwork, let alone get a full Supreme Court review. But the administration is going to ask for an emergency stay. They're going to argue that the project is already partially underway, and that stopping it now would cause irreparable harm. Irreparable harm. That's the phrase they'll use. And the Supreme Court will have to decide whether the harm of a paused ballroom is greater than the harm of an unlawful demolition. I think the answer is obvious. But we'll see. Now I want to talk about something I haven't heard anyone else bring up. The money. $400 million. Where did it come from? Who raised it? Were there any foreign donors? Any corporations with business before the federal government? Any lobbyists looking for access? Because if the president can raise $400 million from private sources to renovate the White House, think about what that says about the relationship between money and power. That's not just a ballroom. That's a way to reward donors. A way to say, you gave me money, and now you get to stand in my ballroom. That's not how it's supposed to work. The White House is supposed to be neutral ground. It's supposed to be the people's house, not a donor lounge. And yet, here we are. So let me wrap this up by telling you why I think this video matters, and why you watching it and thinking about it actually means something. Because this is one of those moments where the average person, you, can see exactly how the system works, how the courts review the executive, how Congress holds the purse strings, how the public can still push back through advocacy groups. And it's also a moment where you can see how fragile those checks really are. They depend on people being willing to use them, on courts being willing to rule against power, on voters being willing to pay attention. And you're paying attention. Right now, you're here. You're thinking about it. That's what I want you to walk away with. Not the ballroom, not the price tag. The idea that the system worked this time, but it was close. So close. And it's going to keep getting tested. Because this isn't the last time a president is going to try something like this. It won't be the last time a court has to say no. And it won't be the last time you and I have to decide whether we care enough to watch. So that's where we are. The ballroom is on hold. The Supreme Court is next. And in 14 days, we'll know a lot more about the future of the American presidency. Or at least, we'll know whether a $400 million ballroom gets built. But you and I both know it's about more than that. It always is. I'll be back when the next piece of this comes down. And if you want to keep following this with me, you know where to find this channel. Because this isn't over. It's just getting started. This isn't over.